Clean my royal palace for a piece of bread? What a pathetic plea. The king's voice exploded like thunder through the marble columns of the throne hall in the royal palace of Valoria. The words fell like whips across the red carpet, while nobles dressed in silk and velvet raised golden goblets of wine and smiled with cruel delight. Beneath bronze chandeliers that gleamed like suspended suns, their crystal drops catching and fracturing light into 1,000 rainbow shards, the golden glow of 1,000 candles danced across the painted faces of ladies in jeweled gowns and the embroidered vests of lords in military decorations. The hall itself was a monument to excess, a cathedral of wealth and power. Walls of white Carrara marble rose 30 feet high, veined with gold leaf that seemed to pulse in the candlelight like living arteries. Tapestries from Brussels hung between Corinthian columns, each one depicting scenes of conquest and glory from centuries past. The vaulted ceiling was painted with clouds and cherubs, a fresco that had taken Italian masters 5 years to complete, where gods looked down on mortals with the same mixture of amusement and contempt that now filled the faces below. The floor beneath their feet was polished so thoroughly it reflected everything above, like a still, dark lake of marble. The air was thick, not just with the scent of expensive perfumes and melted wax from the candles, but with the dense, intoxicating aroma of power itself. This was the celebration of the coronation anniversary of His Majesty King Edward III of Castile, and all of European nobility had bent their knees before him. Ambassadors from France in silk cravats, princes from Aragon with golden sashes, counts from Portugal with emerald rings, all bore witness to the spectacle that the most powerful monarch in Europe was about to provide for their entertainment. Clean my royal palace for a piece of bread? The king repeated the phrase slowly, deliberately, savoring each word as one might savor the most expensive wine. He wanted everyone to hear it, to absorb the audacity of such a request. His voice carried the weight of absolute power, the kind of power that could erase a person's existence with a single word, that could start wars or bring peace, that could elevate commoners to nobility or cast nobles into dungeons. It was the voice of a man who had never, in his entire life, heard the word no. Edward III rose from his throne of solid gold, a massive structure that had been forged from the treasures of 3 conquered kingdoms. He stood tall, over 6 feet, wrapped in robes of royal purple made from Tyrian dye so expensive that each thread cost more than a peasant earned in a lifetime. The robes were embroidered with golden thread in patterns of lions and eagles, symbols of his absolute dominion. In one hand, he held the royal scepter, crowned with a ruby the size of a child's fist that had once belonged to a Persian shah. In the other hand, he gripped a golden goblet encrusted with smaller rubies and sapphires, filled with wine from his private vineyards in Bordeaux. His face was handsome in the way that power makes men handsome: strong jaw, high cheekbones, a nose that suggested Roman ancestry. But his eyes, those cold grey eyes, surveyed the hall with the arrogance of someone who had never bowed his head before anyone. They were predator's eyes, a hawk assessing prey, calculating and cruel. Around him, courtiers bowed and scraped, reverential, flattering his every gesture with practiced smiles and hollow compliments. To his right stood the Count of Seville, Don Martín de Guzmán, a rotund man with a carefully waxed moustache that curled upward at the ends and an emerald ring on every finger. He laughed too loudly at the king's jest, his belly shaking beneath his silk vest, his eyes darting around to ensure others saw his closeness to power. "Brilliant, Your Majesty," he bellowed. "A peasant cleaning the palace. What entertainment!" To the left, the Duchess of Toledo, Doña Isabella de Mendoza. Wrapped in so many pearls, she looked like a walking treasury, covered her mouth with a golden fan painted with scenes of nymphs and satyrs. She feigned scandal with practiced precision, eyes wide, fan fluttering. But beneath the performance, her smile was sharp as any blade. "How amusing," she whispered to her companion, loud enough for others to hear. "Does the creature even know how to hold a mop?" Behind them, arrayed like a human tapestry of wealth and privilege, stood dozens more. Lord Pedro de Castilla in his military medals, laughing. The Archbishop wearing robes worth a bishop's ransom, silent but smiling. Foreign dignitaries in their national costumes, Turkish ambassadors in silk turbans, Venetian merchants in black velvet, all gathered to watch the show, all complicit in the cruelty about to unfold. And in the center of that sea of luxury and disdain, crossing the red carpet like a spectral shadow, like a ghost that had accidentally wandered into a feast of the living, was she? Elena de Montiel, 22 years old. Though hardship had aged her face beyond her years, she was dressed in what could no longer rightfully be called clothing, tattered rags that had once been white but were now the color of old ash, stained with road dust and the sweat of miles walked. The fabric was so worn it was nearly transparent in places, held together by rough stitches she'd done herself with thread pulled from a flour sack. Her brown hair, which might have been beautiful if clean and brushed, hung in tangled strands over thin shoulders that showed too much bone. Her face was gaunt, cheekbones sharp, eyes sunken from hunger and worry. But those eyes, those dark brown eyes, held something the nobles couldn't understand: dignity, unbroken, unbreakable dignity. In her arms, she carried a child, little Anne, 4 years old, a stark and startling contrast to her mother's poverty. The girl had golden curls that caught the candlelight and seemed to glow, cascading over small shoulders like spun sunlight. Her eyes were the deep blue of sapphires, wide and innocent, framed by long lashes. Her face was cherubic, angelic, the kind of beauty that painters spend lifetimes trying to capture. She wore a simple dress, less tattered than her mother's clothes, but still poor, patched in places, and she clung to Elena's neck with small, trembling hands, sensing the danger even if she couldn't understand it. The contrast between mother and child was striking, but even more striking was the contrast between them and everyone else in that hall. Here, where silk rustled and gold gleamed, where every person present could buy and sell a dozen lives without noticing the expense, they were poverty made flesh. They were the stain nobody wanted to see, the reminder of a world that existed beyond these marble walls, a world of hunger and cold and desperate choices. Elena's bare feet, she had no shoes, left faint dusty prints on the gleaming carpet as she walked. Each step required courage that no one in that room could comprehend. Each step was an act of defiance against every instinct that screamed at her to run, to hide, to protect her child from these people's cruel attention. But hunger is a powerful motivator. 3 days without food makes even the impossible seem worth attempting. "Your Majesty," she said, her voice so thin it barely carried across the space between them. It was the voice of someone who had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible, to be invisible. "Have mercy. Allow me to clean your palace in exchange for bread for my daughter." The words hung in the air for a moment, suspended in the shocked silence. Nobody spoke, nobody moved. The musicians in the gallery above had stopped playing mid-note, their instruments frozen. Even the servants along the walls, invisible in their livery, stopped their movements. The entire universe seemed to hold its breath. And then, like a dam breaking, the laughter came. It started with the Count of Seville, his booming guffaw breaking the silence like a hammer through glass. The Duchess of Toledo's high, sharp laugh joined in, almost a shriek. Then the Archbishop's dry chuckle. Lord Pedro's baritone belly laugh, the French ambassador's nasal titter. The laughter spread through the hall like fire through dry grass, sharp and cruel and utterly merciless. It echoed off the marble walls, bounced off the painted ceiling, reverberated through the crystal chandeliers, which began to chime softly with the vibrations. It was the sound of privilege mocking desperation, of power crushing weakness, of cruelty dressed in silk and calling itself entertainment. The ladies laughed behind their fans, the gentlemen laughed into their wine. Even the servants, poor themselves but not as poor as this, allowed small smiles to crack their usually expressionless faces. King Edward let the laughter build, conducting it like a maestro with the slightest movements of his hand. He was an expert at spectacle, at performance. This was theater, and he was the star. Only when the laughter reached its peak did he raise his hand for silence. The hall obeyed instantly, the laughter cut off as if throats had been slit. That was power, the ability to command not just actions but sounds, to orchestrate silence itself. The king stepped forward, down the 3 marble steps that elevated his throne above the floor. His footsteps echoed, click, 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 against the marble. The sound was deliberate, measured, theatrical. He walked toward Elena with the smooth confidence of a hunting cat, his purple robes swirling around him like smoke. "Hear all," he announced, his voice filling every corner of the vast hall. "A peasant woman who dares to request an audience, not for justice, not for mercy from some imagined wrong, but merely to beg for work." He paused, letting the implication sink in. "She offers to scrub floors in exchange for scraps. How generous, how noble. Shall we applaud such ambition?" Scattered laughter rippled through the crowd. Some clapped mockingly. Others shook their heads in amused disbelief. But something unexpected happened. King Edward's eyes, cold and calculating, fell upon the child in Eleanor's arms. Little Anne, sensing the attention, turned to look at him with those impossibly blue eyes, and in that instant, the world stopped. The king's face went white, not pale, white, like freshly fallen snow, like bones bleached in desert sun. The golden goblet slipped from his fingers and fell, wine splashing across the white marble like blood. The ruby-crowned scepter followed a second later, hitting the floor with a clang that sounded like a church bell tolling for the dead. The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the theatrical silence of a performance. This was the silence of shock, of witnessing something impossible, something that defied the natural order of the universe. Edward III, the most powerful man in Europe, the king who made other kings bow, stood frozen, trembling. His hands shook. His lips moved, but no sound emerged. His eyes, those cold predator's eyes, were now wide with something that looked terrifyingly close to fear, because the face looking back at him from Elena's arms was impossible. Those golden curls, that cherubic face, those sapphire blue eyes. It was like looking through a window into the past, like seeing a ghost made flesh. The child was the living, breathing image of Princess Anne, his only daughter, his beloved child who had died 5 years ago in the fire that also took his wife, Queen Eleanor. The entire court, following their king's gaze, now stared at the child with new eyes. Whispers began, soft at first, but growing, spreading like ripples across water. Impossible. It cannot be. The princess. But she's dead. Dead and buried. Or is she? The Count of Seville's face had gone from jovial red to ashen grey. The Duchess of Toledo's fans stopped moving, frozen mid-flutter. The Archbishop crossed himself, whispering Latin prayers. Foreign ambassadors leaned forward, suddenly intensely interested, because if what they were all thinking was true, if what their eyes were showing them was possible, then everything they knew about the last 5 years, everything about the royal succession, about the future of the kingdom, about the very foundations of power in Europe, might be a lie. What? The king's voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. He cleared his throat and tried again. What is the child's name? Elena, confused by the sudden change in atmosphere, by the terror in the king's eyes, where moments before there had been only mockery, answered truthfully, "Anne, your majesty. Her name is Anne." The name fell like an executioner's axe. Several ladies gasped. One fainted, her silk dress billowing as she collapsed onto the marble floor. The Count of Seville grabbed a nearby column for support. The Archbishop's prayers grew louder, and in the back of the hall, almost invisible in the shadows, Count Rodrigo de Aranda, the king's most trusted advisor, went very, very still, his hand moving almost imperceptibly toward the dagger at his waist. Because that name, Anne, had not been spoken aloud in this palace for 5 years, it was forbidden, too painful, the sound of it like reopening a wound that had never truly healed. Everyone in the kingdom knew the story, the tragedy that had broken a king and plunged the nation into mourning. 5 years ago, in the royal wing of the palace, a fire had broken out in the dead of night. No one knew how it started. A knocked candle, perhaps, or sabotage, depending on who told the story. But the flames spread quickly, consuming ancient wood and tapestries with terrifying speed. Queen Eleanor had been sleeping in the princess's chambers that night, reading her daughter a bedtime story, as she often did. The guards found Queen Eleanor's body in the hallway outside Anne's room, overcome by smoke as she tried to save her child. And in the princess's chambers themselves, they found a small body, burned beyond recognition, but clutching the princess's favorite doll. King Edward had never personally identified the remains. His advisors, led by the trusted Count Rodrigo de Aranda, had insisted it was better that way, better to preserve his memory of his daughter as she had been, laughing, playing, full of life. The funeral had been grand, befitting royalty, but the caskets had been closed. All of Europe mourned. Black banners hung from every building. The nation wept for its lost princess. And now, 5 years later, here stood a child who could have been Anne's identical twin, or, impossible thought, could actually be Anne herself. If this story has moved you so far, let us know in the comments what city you're watching from, and leave your like to keep bringing stories that touch the heart. The king's legs nearly gave out. He reached for the edge of his throne to steady himself, but he was too far away. A guard rushed forward to support him, but Edward waved him off angrily, pride warring with shock. He straightened, forced himself to stand tall, but his voice, when he spoke again, carried none of its former power. How? Where? He couldn't form complete sentences. His mind, usually so sharp and calculating, was chaos. Where did you get that child? Elena clutched little Anne tighter, protective instinct overriding fear. She is my daughter, Your Majesty. I found her. This wasn't the voice of a king commanding his subject. This was the voice of a father demanding answers about his child. Elena trembled but stood her ground. She had come too far, risked too much to retreat now. 5 years ago, Your Majesty, I worked in the palace. I was a washerwoman. I cleaned the royal wing. A murmur went through the crowd. Some remembered her vaguely. Servants were invisible to nobility, but some faces lingered in memory. The king gestured impatiently for her to continue. The night of the fire. Elena's voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of the hall, every word carried clearly. I was working late, washing the Queen's linens. When the alarm bells rang, everyone ran. The guards were shouting orders. Servants were fleeing. The smoke was everywhere, thick and black. I got turned around in the corridors, lost in the chaos. She paused, remembering that night with a clarity that still haunted her dreams. I ran toward the gardens, toward fresh air, and that's when I saw her, in the rose garden, lying unconscious beneath a rose bush, far from the burning wing. She was alone, just lying there. Her nightgown was torn and she had scratches on her arms like she'd been running, but she wasn't burned. Not burned at all. The king's eyes were riveted on Elena, drinking in every word. The entire court leaned forward, breathless. I picked her up. She was breathing but wouldn't wake. I heard the guards shouting, "The Queen is dead! The princess is dead!" "Everyone is dead," They were screaming it over and over. I looked back at the palace and saw flames everywhere. The royal wing was collapsing. I didn't know what to do. If I brought the child back and she wasn't the princess, I'd be accused of theft. If she was the princess and everyone thought she was dead, who would believe a washerwoman? They might think I set the fire. They might think I was kidnapping her for ransom. I had lost my own baby just a week before. I ran to my village, to my mother's house, and I raised her. I called her Anne because that was the name I heard in the Queen's screams that night. Anne! Anne! She was calling for her daughter, so I thought perhaps. She trailed off, unable to voice what she'd suspected all these years. The silence that followed was profound, sacred almost. Several ladies were openly weeping now. The Count of Seville had covered his face with his hands. The foreign ambassadors were scribbling furious notes. This story would be told in every capital of Europe before the week was out. King Edward stood motionless, tears streaming down his face, glittering in the candlelight like diamonds. For the first time in 5 years, hope, terrible, fragile hope, bloomed in his chest. Could it be possible? Could his daughter, his precious Anne, be alive? Dr. Valdez, the king's voice was hoarse but commanding. Summon the royal physician, now! Guards scattered to obey. Within minutes, an elderly man in black robes hurried into the hall, carrying a leather bag of medical instruments. Dr. Sebastian Valdez had served the royal family for 30 years. He had delivered Princess Anne, had treated her every childhood illness. If anyone could confirm whether this child was the princess, it would be him. The doctor approached Elena and the child with professional detachment, though his hands trembled slightly as he reached out. "May I?" he asked gently. Eleanor nodded, though she didn't release her hold on Anne. The little girl, now awake and frightened by all the attention and noise, buried her face in Elena's shoulder. Dr. Valdez examined the child carefully, noting details, checking features. Then his face went white. He turned to the king, his voice shaking. "Your Majesty, I must speak with you, privately, now." "Speak here," Edward commanded, "before witnesses." The doctor hesitated, then took a deep breath. "Your Majesty, the child shows many features consistent with Princess Anne. The birthmark on her left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. Princess Anne had the same mark, the unusual double crown in her hair, the specific shade of blue in her eyes, which matches Queen Eleanor's family line. But Your Majesty, but what?" The king's voice was dangerous. "I must confess something I should have told you 5 years ago." The doctor fell to his knees, trembling. "Your Majesty, the body we buried as Princess Anne, I falsified the identification." The hall erupted. Shouts, screams, accusations flew like arrows. Guards drew swords. Ladies fainted in earnest this time. The king held up his hand for silence, and when it didn't come fast enough, he roared, "Silence!" The word echoed off the walls like thunder. Everyone froze. "Explain," the king said softly, dangerously. "Explain or die where you kneel." Dr. Valdez was weeping now, his professional composure shattered. "I was bribed, Your Majesty, threatened, told that if I did not identify the burned body as the princess, my own family would suffer. The body we buried was that of an orphan girl from the village, approximately the same age. I have carried this sin for 5 years, knowing that somewhere perhaps your true daughter might still live. But I was a coward. I was afraid." "Who?" The king's voice was ice. "Who bribed you? Who threatened you?" The doctor's eyes shifted to the shadows at the back of the hall, where Count Rodrigo de Aranda stood frozen, like a statue. "Count Rodrigo, Your Majesty. He orchestrated everything." The accusation fell like a bomb. Before anyone could react, guards were moving, surrounding the count. Rodrigo made no attempt to flee. Instead, he laughed, a bitter, harsh sound that sent chills down spines. "Did you think Rodrigo said, his voice carrying clearly across the stunned hall, that I would simply accept my humiliation. You stripped me of my titles, Edward. You took my lands. You destroyed my family name over a petty political disagreement. So yes, I arranged it. I arranged for your daughter to die. I wanted you to suffer as I suffered. I wanted your lineage to end with you. I wanted you to die alone and bitter, knowing you had failed to protect what you loved most. The confession was so casually delivered, so devoid of remorse, that it took a moment for its full meaning to sink in. Then the hall erupted again, this time with rage. Nobles who moments before had been mocking a beggar woman were now screaming for Rodrigo's blood. The archbishop was calling down divine judgment. Foreign ambassadors were backing toward the exits, wanting no part of what was about to happen. Guards seized Rodrigo, dragging him forward. He made no resistance, still smiling that bitter smile. "Go ahead," he told the king. "Execute me. It changes nothing. You still lost 5 years with your daughter. I still won." King Edward stood frozen, torn between overwhelming joy that his daughter lived and overwhelming rage at the man who had stolen 5 years of her life. His hand went to the sword at his waist. Every person in the hall expected him to draw it, to end Rodrigo's life right there. Justice demanded it, honor demanded it, revenge screamed for it. But the king's eyes fell on Elena, still holding Anne protectively, and on the child herself, who watched everything with wide, frightened eyes. And in that moment, something in him broke and rebuilt itself differently. Slowly, deliberately, he descended the throne steps again. But this time he didn't approach Rodrigo. He approached Elena, the beggar woman in rags, the woman who had saved his daughter when everyone else had failed. And then, as the entire European court watched in stunned disbelief, King Edward III, the most powerful monarch in Europe, the man who had never bowed to anyone, lowered himself to his knees before her. The silence was absolute, sacred. No one breathed. "Forgive me," Edward said, and his voice was broken, humble, stripped of all pride. Tears streamed down his royal face. "I humiliated you before the world when you were the only one who saved what I love most in this kingdom. You are no servant. You are the mother my daughter knows and loves. You are the woman who protected her when I failed to. You gave her life when I thought she was dead. How can I ever repay such a debt?" Elena, with a dignity that no crown could ever confer, looked down at the kneeling king. Her voice, when she spoke, was calm and clear. "Your Majesty, I didn't come here seeking repayment. I didn't come for gold or titles or recognition. I came because my little girl was hungry, and I would do anything, even face a king's mockery, to feed her. But I see now that she has 2 families, the family that raised her and the family that lost her. She needs both. Have you ever felt invisible? Have you ever been judged by your appearance, diminished by someone with power? This story reminds us that sometimes the greatest wisdom enters not in royal procession, but in humble circumstances. Perhaps you or someone you know has experienced this too. Tell us in the comments. The king looked up at her, this woman in rags who spoke with more grace than any noble in his court. "What do you ask of me?" he said. "Name it, and it is yours." Eleanor thought for a long moment, and then she said something that would be remembered and repeated throughout Europe for generations. "I ask only for respect, Your Majesty. Not just for me, but for every person who enters these halls, regardless of the clothes they wear or the station they were born to. I ask that you remember this moment, when a beggar woman saved your kingdom's future, and let it change how you see your people. Because today, I gave you back your daughter. Tomorrow, let that gift remake your reign." The words hit harder than any sword blow. They exposed truths that comfort had hidden, that power had obscured. And in that moment, something shifted in the hall, not just in the king, but in every person present. They had come to witness a beggar's humiliation, and instead, witnessed a king's transformation. Edward rose slowly, wiping tears from his face. He turned to his guards. "Take Count Rodrigo to the dungeons. He will be tried for treason, for conspiracy, for 5 years of unforgivable cruelty, but we will not kill him. Death is too easy. Instead, he will spend the rest of his natural life imprisoned, thinking every day about how his revenge failed, how the child he tried to kill has been returned, how his bitterness served only to create beauty." Then the king did something unprecedented. He removed his own royal cloak, the purple one worth a fortune, and draped it around Eleanor's shoulders. "You will stay in this palace," he said, "not as a servant, but as an honored guest. You will have rooms in the East Wing. Anne, my Anne, our Anne, will have her royal chambers returned, but she will visit you whenever she wishes. You will raise her as you have been raising her, with love and care, and I will learn to be the father I should have been, if you're willing." Elena looked down at little Anne, who was reaching out toward the king with curiosity now that the shouting had stopped. The child didn't remember him, but children sense love, and there was so much love pouring from Edward's eyes that it was almost visible. "I'm willing," Elena said softly, "for her sake." The transformation was complete. The beggar had become royalty, not through blood or marriage, but through character. The king had become human again, not through power or conquest, but through humility. And a little girl who had been both peasant and princess would grow up understanding that she was always, simply, herself. The hall erupted in applause then, genuine this time, not mocking. The nobles who had laughed at Elena now applauded her. The foreign ambassadors made note of this unprecedented event. The archbishop blessed them all. And somewhere in the back of the hall, servants watched with tears in their eyes, seeing for the first time in their lives that mercy and justice could triumph over cruelty and power. The months that followed were a revelation for everyone in the kingdom. The palace, once a place of rigid hierarchy and cold formality, became something different. Princess Anne spent her mornings in the royal tutors' rooms, learning languages and history and music, and her afternoons in Elena's modest chambers, learning to cook and mend and tell stories. She grew up understanding both worlds, never fully belonging to one or the other, but creating a bridge between them. King Edward changed too. He began taking meals in the servants' quarters once a week, listening to their concerns and stories. He revised tax laws that had been crushing the poor. He opened the royal treasury to fund schools and hospitals. When his nobles objected, he simply said, "A beggar woman saved my kingdom's future. How many other gifts am I blind to because I judge by appearances?" Elena never moved into fancier quarters, though they were offered repeatedly. She kept her modest rooms and her simple clothes, accepting only what she needed to be comfortable. She became an advisor to the king on matters concerning the common people, speaking for those who had no voice. Her influence was quiet but profound, and the kingdom flourished under the balanced rule of power, tempered by compassion. And what of the courtiers who had mocked her? Most felt shame, though few would admit it openly. The Count of Seville retired to his estates, reportedly a changed man who gave generously to the poor. The Duchess of Toledo commissioned paintings of Elena, hanging them in her home as a reminder of her own capacity for cruelty and the need for constant vigilance against it. But the greatest change was in how people saw each other. The story of the beggar who saved the princess spread across Europe like wildfire. In taverns and churches, in castles and cottages, people told and retold the tale. It became a legend, yes, but more than that, it became a mirror, forcing everyone who heard it to ask themselves what they would have done, how they judged others, whether their treatment of the less fortunate would survive scrutiny in the light of truth. Princess Anne grew into a wise and compassionate ruler, never forgetting her humble beginnings. In her throne room, she kept Elena's tattered dress preserved in a glass case with a plaque that read, "This is my true crown. It reminds me I was loved when I had nothing. It teaches me to see value where others see only poverty." If this revelation touched your heart, share this story with someone who needs to remember that dignity always wins. Comment below if you've also been underestimated. Your story matters and can inspire others. We're building a community that lifts each other up. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that touch the heart. Years later, on his deathbed, King Edward called Elena to his side. She came, older now, but still possessing that same quiet dignity. "I need to tell you something," he said, his voice weak but clear. "I was wrong to kneel before you that day." Elena's eyes widened in surprise, but he continued, "I should have knelt years before. I should have knelt before every beggar, every servant, every person I dismissed as beneath me. You didn't teach me to humble myself before you. You taught me that I had been kneeling to the wrong things, power, pride, wealth, when I should have been honoring the courage and dignity that exists in every human heart. Thank you for that lesson. It made me a better king. More importantly, it made me a better father." Elena took his hand, tears in her eyes. "You learned it, Your Majesty. That's what matters. You learned it and you changed." How many kings can say that? He smiled at peace. And when he died days later, the entire kingdom mourned, not just because they'd lost a king, but because they'd lost a man who had learned to be humble, who had been transformed by compassion, who had proved that it's never too late to change. The cathedral was packed for his funeral. Nobles and commoners stood side by side, for once united in grief. And when they carried the king's casket through the streets, Elena walked beside Princess Anne, wearing not silk or jewels, but a simple dress, honored not for what she wore, but for who she was. And so the story ends where it began, in a throne room filled with witnesses. But everything has changed. The laughter has turned to understanding. The mockery has become respect. The powerless woman revealed the weakness in power, and the powerful king discovered strength in humility. This story belongs to all of us. How many times have we felt invisible? How many times have we believed our circumstances defined our worth? Elena shows us they don't. She proves that true royalty isn't inherited through bloodlines, but earned through character. She reminds us that sometimes what we think we're begging for is nothing compared to what we're actually carrying. Her legacy lives on in every person who hears this tale and chooses compassion over cruelty, understanding over judgment, dignity over despair. In a world obsessed with power and status, her story is a revolution, a quiet, persistent reminder that the greatest treasures often come in the poorest packages, and that sometimes the person we dismiss as worthless is carrying the very thing that could save us. Thank you for walking this journey with us. Thank you for believing that stories matter, that they can transform hearts and change minds. If you've ever been the underdog, if you've ever been judged unfairly, if you've ever found courage in impossible circumstances, this story is yours. Carry it with you. Share it freely. Let it remind you that dignity cannot be stolen, only surrendered. And you have never ever surrendered yours. Leave your like if you believe in the power of dignity and transformation. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it today. And tell us in the comments, which moment touched your heart most? Was it when the king knelt? When Elena spoke about respect? Or when we realize that love transcends every boundary we create? Subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss stories that inspire, challenge, and transform. Because that's what we do here. We tell stories that matter. Stories about people like Elena, like you, like all of us, discovering that we're so much more than the circumstances we were born into. Remember, humiliation is temporary, but dignity is eternal. Power can be lost, but character endures, and it's never ever too late for transformation. May you, like Elena, discover that sometimes what looks like weakness is actually strength, what seems like ending is actually beginning, and what feels like losing is actually winning everything that truly matters. The candles have burned down, the court has dispersed, but the truth remains. True royalty isn't inherited. It's earned through love, proven through sacrifice, and witnessed in those quiet moments when we choose to see the humanity in others instead of their station. Go forth and be royal. You already are.